But I really need to start by asking you about this monumental debacle around the leaking of information from the MOD and the subsequent super-injunction that made it all a secret. Your reaction?
So I only found out about this yesterday, as most of us did. Look, we had this terrible leak of tens of thousands of names of people in Afghanistan who had helped us while we were there. And the leaking of that, of course, would have been a present danger to them in terms of the Taliban getting hold of that information, potentially murdering people, torturing people, and so on. So I think it was right back in a couple of years ago when this happened that the government stepped in to make sure that the fact that that information was out there was kept private rather than going out into the public domain. And where we are today is clearly that this government, having continued that policy for a year, have decided that now is the appropriate time to take the injunction off.
I think I'm right in saying you weren't a member of the government at the time, but do you now think those who were, Grant Shapps and Ben Wallace in particular, as Defence Secretaries, have got questions to answer? They should be held to account for their decision-making.
Well, I think the principle of what happened, Matt, though, it seems to me, is right, that if you have a situation where
keeping things a secret.
Well, I think if there are tens of thousands of lives potentially at risk here, then I think you do have to take appropriate action to make sure you minimise the chance of people losing their lives or being tortured as a consequence of that information being out there. But that's not the same thing, of course, as saying that there aren't lots of questions that are now out there that need to be answered.
Yeah.
And I think that this is where Parliament will be critical, particularly the Defence Select Committee, who've announced that they will have an inquiry into this, and we will get to the bottom of all those questions, the ones you pose and many others.
Let me finish off on this with the last question asked John Healy. I'll ask it of you. With 457 British service personnel killed in Afghanistan, thousands, it seems, possibly put at risk by this leak, and the Taliban back in power today, was it just the wrong decision to ever go into Afghanistan in the first place?
Well, I don't think I would see it like that. You've got, for example, America's position in this whole situation, which was part of why there was ultimately a withdrawal from Afghanistan. But I think you have to deal with the world as it is at that particular moment in time. And I think when we went into Afghanistan to provide that kind of support that we did with our allies, that was the right decision to have taken.
Your opposite number, Chancellor Rachel Reeves, was speaking at the Mansion House last night. She wiped away the tears, and I say that because she acknowledged that upset herself last night. She had a big smile on her face as she announced a cutting of red tape in lots of ways for the city, trying to loosen things to make mortgage borrowers get their foot on the housing ladder, and also trying to encourage more of us to invest our ISAs in stocks and shares as the stock market in London seems to be stagnating to a degree. Do you think it's all a good thing?
Well, look, I think anything that is aiming to sensibly increase investment in our economy is a good thing. Now, I don't agree with all of the things that you've just mentioned there. ISAs, I have an issue around that. I think probably she shouldn't be looking at changing the limits that you can put into ISAs because a lot of people depend on them. But all of that apart, the most important thing you have to do is to run an economy that is growing and successful and creating opportunities. And that is the bit that is missing. So this government came into office, loaded up taxes on businesses, stifled growth. They borrowed huge amounts of money, spent large amounts of money, which has pumped up inflation. And we've just seen the latest inflation numbers that were higher than expected. It's not coming down, it's going up. And the consequence of that is interest rates higher for longer, which of course is hurting businesses, those that have mortgages. And it's also meaning the servicing cost, Matt, on our burgeoning national debt is now running at £100 billion a year, twice what we spend on defence. So you add all that up, and that is not a successful economy, I'm afraid.
You mentioned interest rates. I think it's 4 weeks tomorrow, August the 7th, that we'll get a decision from the Monetary Policy Committee.
Exactly.
And all the mood music suggests they'll cut it by a quarter of a point, maybe even half a point. And this is coming from Andrew Bailey, the Governor of the Bank of England, seem to be signalling that's the direction of travel.
Well, yes, but these are figures that we've just had this morning on inflation. Inflation is higher and has risen higher than was expected. So I think the likelihood of an interest rate cut on the 7th of August has probably diminished as a consequence of what has happened. But the bottom line is, if you have a government that stokes inflation by spending lots of money,
they would say the global climate is what is stoking inflation, so, energy prices primarily, and shocks to the oil price as well because of situations in the Middle East. They would point to that.
There are many inflationary pressures, but the government controls some of those inflationary pressures. Spending money, for example, is one of them. And what they've chosen to do is to borrow huge amounts of money and spend huge amounts of money. Now, most of the financial institutions out there, you know, the OBR, the Bank of England, etc., will readily accept that inflation, in fact, is higher than it would have been had they not been stoking up the economy in the way that they have, albeit that, of course, has not led to growth.
I think she has sat within her own fiscal rules for the time being, even though the headroom has been lowered to a degree. And also, they would say they're trying to fill the gap that you left them in the public finances. We've discussed that at length before. I know you disagree. If you were back in tomorrow, what policy levers would you be pulling to stimulate growth?
OK, so you're asking me if the car had crashed into the wall at 100 miles an hour. Here we are, Mel. Take the steering wheel and tell us how you're taking it to get us out of the
Conservative policy ideas.
We would have taken a very different approach to the economy. So, firstly, we would not have been taxing the living daylights out of businesses, which hits growth. We would have been focusing on productivity, so we wouldn't have been giving 15% or 14% to train drivers, 22% to junior doctors, with no strings attached, no requirement for
junior
greater
doctors
efficiency.
are still going on strike, by the way.
Exactly. So Labour said, Wes Streeting said before the election, why don't the Conservatives get round the table and just settle this and we can all move on? Well, he did that and we've seen what has happened. They're now looking at going back on strike. But the final thing is gripping welfare. We've got spiralling welfare costs. And we in government had shown that we could start to control that budget. We had savings of £5 billion due to reforms that we brought in. And we had much more to do. We've seen what this government's done on welfare. It had a welfare bill, which its own backbenchers basically booted out.
You could have supported it in its original form, couldn't you?
They didn't go far enough and they did it in entirely the wrong way. But the point that I'm saying, to get back to your point about the black hole, the only black hole we've got is not of Labour's invention, because that's what the 22 billion is about. It's of their creation. So the 5 billion that they failed to get through Parliament in welfare savings is an unfunded commitment, as is the U-turn on winter fuel payments. You add those two together, you get a £6 billion black hole. And we are now heading into the autumn through a summer of uncertainty for businesses and people up and down the country, almost certainly into tax increases in the autumn.
Yeah.
And all of that is of this government's making.
But the fact is just, Mel Stride, to finish off, since the 60s, when we were a high taxation economy, we've become a very low taxation economy. Whichever path you're in, don't we just need to get real about paying for what we want?
So what we've got to do, actually, is we've got to move to an economy that is radically but sensibly rewired. And that means lower taxes, a lower tax burden. It means simpler taxes, and it means taxes.
Do you think that gets more back for the economy by lower taxation?
If you overhaul the tax system so it relentlessly leans into growth, if you get on top of the size of the state, if you slim that down and make it more efficient, if you get your skills offer sharpened up as you're bringing down net migration, if you get on the top of welfare spending, and if you address those supply side issues, building homes, railways, roads, and getting energy costs down.
Yeah.
If you can do those things, and that's a big task, and that's what we are putting together in opposition, because we have the time to do that now, then we can truly have a dynamic, expanding economy that's there and inclusive for everybody.
It has to be said, it's easy to say after the fact, when it was both the civil service and the welfare bill that ballooned under the last Conservative government.
Look, we had 365,000 civil servants before COVID. We've got 515,000 today. That speaks to a bloated state. And my party will absolutely radically address that.
You've
and we are
changed
putting
enough
our plans.
to do that.
Absolutely. We will slim down those that size of the state, make it more efficient and more productive. We will live within our means. We will be fiscally responsible going forward. But we will design and rewire our economy so that it's growing much faster. And it can meet the challenges that we have of higher defence, of an ageing population, and having younger people having a stake in the UK economy in a way that they haven't for some generations.
Mel Stride, thank you.